Give me a second. When you pulled up the share screen, I lost my notes. So I just need to find them again.
Mhm. Okay, it's 12:05. I think we should
Just have to
start.
give me a minute. My notes are gone. So- and I have to have it to read that to do it properly. So there's got to be a way I can get back to my own screen, right?
Tammy is the expert.
Is there something to get rid of this share screen for a moment and get back to my own computer, Tammy? Thank you. So thank you all very much for coming today. I'm Linda McKay-Panos, and I'm the Executive Director of the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center, who are hosting this event today. And I would like to start with our land acknowledgement. And so our offices are located at the University of Calgary, which is located in the heart of Southern Alberta. So we will both acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, because we're in Treaty 7 land. These include the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda Nation, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. Also, the city of Calgary is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Districts 5 and 6. Okay, so that's that. And then I was just asked to say a few words about Jean Augustine. And um, Jean Augustine was the first Black Canadian woman to serve as a minister and a member of Parliament. And she was a Liberal member from 1993 to 2006. And she represented Etobicoke Lakeshore. And she was also the Minister of State for Multiculturalism and Status of Women in Cabinet and Parliamentary Secretary to Prime Minister John Chrétien. She's had an illustrious career, but the most relevant to today's event is that she was responsible for passing a motion to designate February as Black History Month in Canada. She also, interestingly, passed a motion to erect a monument to the famous Five on Parliament Hill, which I did not know till I researched this. And so she has a connection to York University as well. In fact, they set up a chair in 2008, Jean Augustine Chair in Education, which was established in the Faculty of Education at York University. So I think it's important for us to know the beginnings of Black History Month in Canada. And thank you for listening.
Okay, so Tammy, I think you can share your screen again. Okay, so next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Carl James and Dr. Jennifer Adams, who will be our speakers today. I am Pamela Dos-Ramos, and I'm a human rights educator at the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center. The first person I'm going to introduce actually is Temi Oluluye, who is a human rights educator, and Tammy's also a lawyer working at the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center. That's always a mouthful. So my first introduction is going to be Dr. Carl James. Now, Dr. James is the Jean Augustine Chair in Education, Community, and Diaspora in the Faculty of Education at York University. Carl's research interests include studying the schooling experiences and educational outcomes of racialized students and Black students. In particular, noting the ways in which race and its intersection with ethnicity, gender, class, citizenship, generational status, and other characteristics mediates their lives and their participation in society. Carl engages in initiatives that are premised on notions of equity, inclusion, and social justice that aim to respond to the situation of Black youth. One such project is the Securing Black Futures, a Royal Bank of Canada funded project, which is being undertaken with colleagues from other universities, such as University of Calgary, Dalhousie University, McMaster University, the University of British Columbia, Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson, and the University of Ottawa. Carl will be introducing today the Securing Black Futures project. He will summarize its aims and relevance, and he'll note how the programs of the various institutions, Dalhousie, McMaster, UBC, Ottawa, and TMU, the Toronto Metropolitan University, how they're engaging Black students. Carl will reference the experiences at York University, but he'll also spend more time talking about the usefulness of programs like these to help address the educational needs, ambitions, and issues of Black students. Our next speaker will be Dr. Jennifer Adams. Dr. Adams is a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair of Creativity, Equity, and STEM, which, as you know, is Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math, and professor at the University of Calgary. She's in the Department of Chemistry, and she's affiliated with the Workland School of Education in the Faculty of Education. She's the principal investigator of the Creativity, Equity, and STEM Lab, where she and her team research equity in STEM teaching and learning environments, with an emphasis on identity affirming, anti-deficit, desiring, and justice-oriented approaches. She's in leadership on several Canadian national projects, including Securing Black Futures, which seeks to increase the visibility and support the flourishing of Black students in STEM, and the Canadian Black Scientists Network, where she's involved with a national data collection project about Black students' STEM experiences. She serves the steering committee as a co-leader on STEM education, pathways, and post-secondary projects, and she's the principal investigator of the STEM Beyond Borders initiative, which will examine research, policy, and practice in Canada and the United States around equity and justice in STEM education and careers for Black students. Dr. Adams was recognized by the Calgary Black Chambers with an award for Black achievement in STEM. Prior appointments that she has held include Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York, the American Museum of National History, and the New York City Department of Education. Dr. Adams will talk about the program here at the University of Calgary and what the students have been up to in the program. So I hand you over to Timmy, who will begin the moderation.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be at this event today. I'm particularly excited because of the two speakers that we'll be hearing from. As you know, my name is Tammy, and I'll be moderating this event. So we'll start off with Dr. James speaking on the Securing Black Futures project and participating programs at Canadian universities. Thereafter, Dr. Adams is going to speak about the program here at the University of Calgary, and there will be a joint discussion session. I invite you to please put down your questions because we'll have a question and answer session at the end of it. So as the questions come to your mind, please write them down so that you don't lose track of those. This promises to be a very interesting event. So I'm not going to waste too much time. I'm going to hand over to Dr. James right now.
Thank you very much, Timmy. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation to be part of this discussion and to be able to have the opportunity right now to present with Jennifer in Calgary, of course, and to talk about what we're doing with trying to get the agenda of Black students in mainstream university status. So I want to start with some remarks, and Jennifer will take over, and then I'm looking forward to conversations that we are going to have and build on. Really, that will be so useful for us. I'm also very conscious that we're doing this in Black History Month, and I want to get to that conversation about what does this mean that you're doing this, or you call Jennifer and I to have this discussion in Black History Month. What does it mean? What does it represent? And I'll come to that in a while. And even talking about Jean Augustine having established officially making this a federal fact in Canada is important for us to reflect on when these conversations take place. But I want to start with the idea of where we are now and the project that we refer to that Jennifer and I are working on. Under the headline, "Every year spent in school or university improves life expectancy." That was a study that was recently produced. Richard Adams, writing in the Guardian, a British newspaper, reflecting on this discussion in the Lancet Public Health Journal, wrote that according to the first systemic study directly linking education to gains in longevity, the education becomes and schooling becomes an important fact. He writes, "Every year spent in school or university improves our life expectancy, while not attending school is as deadly as smoking or heavy drinking." And he goes on, the study that was found that adults' risk of mortality went down by 2% every year in full-time education. And he goes on, by completing primary, secondary, and tertiary education, it's equivalent to a lifetime of eating a healthy diet, lowering the risk of death by 34% compared with those with no formal education. And he says, at the opposite extreme, not attending school at any point was as bad for adult health as consuming 5 or more drinks every day, 5 or more alcoholic drink every day, or smoking 10 cigarettes each day for a decade. The study adds impetus to what we do in terms of encouraging and helping students to stay in school and also to attend university. And where Black students are on that scale is important for us. And that's what I think we're doing with the Securing Black Futures project. And we will only know the effects of that probably in 60 years from now. But for now, let's see and hear and talk about what we're attempting to do in that regard. Statistics Canada reported that in this decade, that's 2019 to 2028, about 75% of new jobs will require post-secondary education. So therefore, it is always important for us to think about Black students participating in post-secondary education. If they're not, why not? And what could be done to enable and support them in going through and getting that post-secondary education. In a study I did with colleagues, Julian Perak and Robert Brown, and this was about 2018, we looked at the educational trajectory of students, more than 11,000 students in the Toronto area. And we were wondering and studying the journeying through high school and through university. The findings indicate that compared with their peers, Black students were not as much represented in university and graduating from university as their other peers, white peers, South Asian and Asian peers. And yet, and in that case, that means that has implications for their social and economic development later in life. When students are accepted in university, though, and we were very interested in that, the opportunity to enroll was very much perceived as an opportunity to increase their social and economic mobility. Getting into university is in itself for many a celebration for them. And I keep remembering how parents react to once your children go to university, especially parents who might be immigrants. They see that as a very, very feat to be celebrated, but often we think that once we have gotten them to university, then that's going to be it for us working with them and ensuring that their success. But we know, though, that regardless of that, getting in is only one step towards achieving their success. Critical understanding of the world might be engaged when they get there, but entry to university is yet a very important thing to look at, and what happens in university is what we are exploring. In the study that I did, as I mentioned, we found that the students did not find university as supportive as they expected. What we found that only about 50% of the Black students, and this is another similar study was done with students going through other universities, only about 50% of the Black students graduated, while nearly up to 70% South Asian and white, 60 to 70% of those other students graduated from university. So our interest here and what we're working, how could we keep them in university and have them not think of their interest and their aspirations and ambitions being thwarted once they get into university? I think here as well, it's not university generally, but also think of specific programs of that students might be in. For example, at York University, where business, law, engineering, in general science, not very many Black students are in those programs, but we might find them more often in social service programs, social science programs, and social work programs. What I also find interesting that you do not see as many in psychology as a program. And we have to start thinking of what are these courses that's not, what are these students not doing in really helping to keep these students and attract these students into these programs. What I've found as well, when we talk of Black students, it's not just students, Black students generally, but we have to think of generational difference. What the data also shows that first generation, that means students who might have migrated here at a young age, or their parents might be immigrants, are more likely to be found in university, more likely to be succeeding in university and so forth, than students who might have been here for generations. And that's, and for me, is a critical point that we must say. And I can reflect on this idea because on Monday I was giving a presentation, and I make that point similarly in my presentation to at this university. And this older gentleman said, well, he's critiquing my data and saying, well, the information he has is that people who are here over generations tend to do better than their parents. And he says, and he knows of people who are their economic level of and other and social level, of course, when they compared to that of parents, is much better because it increases over the years while they're here. But what he's not paying attention to, or wasn't paying attention to, as I would say, is the fact that we were talking of what is the particular situation of Black students in the Canadian context that we need to pay attention to. The other important thing for Black students is the idea of gender. What we observe then is gender plays a significant role in their experience through high school and through university. And while we might find more Black young women are in university and succeeding in university or accessing university, it doesn't necessarily mean that the anti-Black racism that they experience is any less than that of young men, but we have to see how is it different that they're able to navigate the system in university and be able to stay there and go through the system as they'd want. And so I want to now turn to how, with the Securing Black Futures, we're trying to address some of those things with regard to the students that we're working with. And so we're trying to deepen our understanding, because what I've found is that while I have lots of information about experiences, and I think this would be the same in Alberta as well, while we have lots of experiences of students' lives in high school and Black student lives in high school, we do not have as much information about their journey through college and university. That's important. So what we're trying to find out is what we can capture about their lives in university and how we can use that information or that data to speak to having policy changes, program changes that will make Black students in university be more successful as they journey through university. So Securing Black Futures then is deepening that understanding of the lives of Black students, and as much as possible, helping to address the barriers that they might encounter once there. And so and of course, with the Royal Bank of Canada funds, which we got some money, we're trying to do actual programs with Black students in university that will keep them in university. But I want to underscore the fact that while we're doing this as a program in university, and we don't want this program to be just simply us doing it. Somehow, at some level, the university is going to have to take responsibility for addressing these things and putting in place actual institutional factors or institutional programs that will address the situation of university. And at York, then, what we do is we're having not only working with students, and at York we have groups of 5 or so students who we're working with as a cohort group, and they're coming from such programs of psychology, engineering, education, business, and these are programs that we see very few Black students. And with this small group of students, they meet monthly, what we call a common hour kind of thing. We meet every bi-weekly, and we discuss what their lives are like in university, that one, but also operate as information gatherers or data gatherers to give us more sense of the Black experience in the university as that goes on. The other thing too, where we connect with high schools in the Toronto area. And so when we bring students to university on the idea of imagine yourself in university, that because we're also noticing or knowing that many students have never been on a university campus, and experiencing the university campus before actually coming to university would enable them to feel much more, I know I know this space even before I got here, and through that they would feel some comfort in being in university. In that regard, the students at university with whom we're working serve as mentors or hosts of these high school students when they come on campus. And as hosts, there would, one person might host about 4 or 5 of these high school students, chaperoning them around the university, taking them to classes with them, having them meet other faculty members with them, having conversations with them. And through that, they, as university students, are also seeing their role as significant to not only themselves, but also to these young people whom they chaperone for a day at university. It's important to do this too, because in most research will show for many of Black students, the idea of community plays a significant role in their lives. They feel that sometimes they're going to school, they're doing their education because they want to, quote unquote, give back to the community. They feel a sense of obligation to their community. And so in this regard, as they nurture and work with students whom they chaperone while on the university campus, they see them, they're also learning about the usefulness of education, but at the same time, nurturing these university students towards sharing the barriers, the challenges, and the wins that they have had in terms of accessing university. Last night at York too, and I'm coming to you, Jennifer, in about a few minutes. But last night at York, we typically have the Black History Month event, and to which we invite Jean Augustine. And it happens every year. Last night was the event with Jean Augustine. We had literally, there was no room, sit room for people. People had to leave because they were literally, the room was full, over 250 people, and the room was only supposed to hold 200 people. But that was one of the biggest turnout. And one of the reasons why it was so big too is because the students with whom we work in schools come to that event, and some of them, they do their poetry or their rap dancing, or one person played her flute. So it's not only a presentation of the university doing what we do at university in terms of, because we do it with people in fine arts area. So there were the choirs who sang, etc., and it's online, so you can look. Not only the York University music and choir and so forth presented, but also high school students were given the opportunity to present at the university, and they brought their parents and they brought their friends. And so here the university space become a space where community can be part of and can be useful. Now, I talked very briefly early about we're doing this on Black History Month. I don't know how much this might be taken up in Alberta, but there's a recent article that I saw yesterday actually, with this elected person saying that Black History Month pushes an agenda of segregation. So why don't we just simply have everybody talking about Canadian history? So Black history. So she would want Black history not Black History Month to be this segregated thing in the Canadian landscape. But what I want us to think about when we think of this, and yes, let's have this discussion in February, but look at what is being admitted to. The admittance is that we do not have that Canadian history that we present is an incomplete history because it doesn't tell of the experiences and the presence of Black people in the Canadian society. So if we had that history talking about the Black presence, then we would not have to have this Black history. But at the other hand, how can you say that you're presenting or preaching Canadian history without having the information of all the groups who have contributed to the development of the Canadian society included in that Canadian history? So it's not a segregation, though, I'd argue, but it's a way of saying that we need to probably pay attention to all the people. And when we think of the Black presence in Canada, we have to go back to the 1600s when they were brought here to become and were enslaved. We have to go back to talking about Black Indigenous or Afro-Indigenous people who also a community of people who also have contributed to the Canadian society. And that talks about the longevity of the Black presence here in the Canadian society. So when we think of this, and when we are talking about the Black students' presence on university campus, it's not that they should be seen as, oh, you're here, try to fit in, but we should also be thinking here, how has the university accommodated the presence of Black students? And in so doing, making them more successful students, knowing that they're supposed to be found in all areas of the university community. And one last point. Many universities today are talking about EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I wonder, and I look at these websites to find out or to see how many of these universities can tell me what percentage of the population is Black, what percentage of the population is Asian, et cetera, et cetera. And how do you know you're being inclusive if you don't have that kind of information? So we have to push university also to collect data, and not just simply data based on numbers, but data based on qualitative information, knowing about the experiences of the students once they're on campus and the extent to which we're responsive to their experiences and making the university experience relevant and responsive to their ambitions. So that's all for me. And one of the significant is talking about Black presence in STEM, and that's absolutely critical, very, very critical area. And Jennifer takes over from here. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks, Carl. Thank you for setting up that context, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. And I'm going to share my screen, and it worked before, but of course it's not going to. Wait, give me 1 second. I have to find, why is my PowerPoint not showing? Okay, can you all see this now?
Yes.
Secure? Awesome. Okay, so what I want to do is just to run you through a little bit of the project at the University of Calgary under the umbrella of the Securing Black Futures. And so the loose agenda is going to be, describe a little bit of the context and background, describing some of the discussions that we've had, that I've had with the students, and then the projects that emerged from, from those discussions. Okay. All right, so when I first got the project, it was about gathering students, so the first couple of iterations of it didn't work as well, like, having the numbers of students that wanted to be involved because of, they're just coming out of COVID. I didn't really know where the Black students gathered and all of that, so it was very challenging to get students involved. However, at the think it was the middle of last semester or something, I noticed that the Black students were having a gathering. It was, fostered by the African Caribbean Students Association and some of the other ethnic related student associations on campus. Oh no, it was the African Studies program, because the students advocated for themselves to get an African Studies program, to get, to get salaries for faculty and everything like that, and to get courses and things. So they were advocating to build, to continue to build that program. So I was invited to come to their event, and then I talked to them about, or I invited them, I told them that what this was about a chance to learn about students' experiences in STEM, and then also to talk about how we can work together to make things better for them on campus. And what we did, well, when they gathered, what I decided to do along with my graduate students who are also involved in the project is to really think about, like, or to theorize, which is what, social sciences like to do, scientists like to do. It's like, what is it like to be Black in campus? What is it like to be Black in Canada? Because, as everybody likes to tell us, a lot of the literature is coming from the United States. So, oh no, it's not relevant to, to Canada. So we read things like, for example, The Racial Contract with Charles Mills, and he sets up how that racial hierarchy emerges, and it's very relevant for any kind of settler colonial country, which Canada is. And Catherine McKittrick writes in about Nothing is Shocking in one of her chapters, I think it's in the Dare Science book, and writes about like how the presence of Black people in Canada, is like a surprise, because there's almost like this notion that we're ever present, but yet invisible at the same time. And then, and there were other readings and things. So I'm just showing some of the key ones. And then we read Suspending Damage by Eve Tuck, which talks about moving away from damage-centered research that focuses on the issues that, and she's an Indigenous scholar that focuses on the issues of Indigenous and other racialized people in, in multiple colonial contexts. And it doesn't mean to ignore the challenges that exist, but rather to focus on how we are going to make things better, rather than also always focusing on the damage, because focusing on the damage has a tendency to replicate problems and projects that continue to perpetuate the damage that's already there. So as a part of it too, I talked about some of the history, that is relevant in the United States, and also with the students, we talked about how it could extend it to Canada. So we talked about Black Solidarity Day. This is in November usually, so I think the Monday or Tuesday or something before Election Day. And, meant to unify, highlight the diversity of the African and Caribbean American New York communities, and to show their economic contribution to society. So this was supposed to be a day where, you don't do anything that's contributing to the economics unless it's a Black-owned business. So the students and we talked about that. We talked about what would this mean. We watched a little video about Black Solidarity Day, and talked about what would this mean for Black people in Canada. And then, with going back to Eve Tuck's article, we started to talk about the notion of desire and what does that mean. And here's a nice quote from Audre Lorde that kind of that summarizes it. The erotic is a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feelings. So we can think about, as Black people, like, what are things that have been unexpressed in this settler colonial context, and what are our feelings that have been long unrecognized? And even up until today, that whenever we voice our concerns or our opinions, like, we're automatically labeled as aggressive or as the angry Black woman. In order to perpetuate itself, every oppression must corrupt or distort those various sources of power within the culture of the oppressed that can provide energy for change. So one of the ways they do this is by repressing desires. So the desires for equity, desires for recognition, they try to repress those desires. So we talked about how can we realize our unexpressed desires in post-secondary education. Because when we talked with our students about what were their experiences like on campus, they talked a lot about, feeling isolated in their majors, especially the STEM students that came. And going back to the recruitment, although I recruited STEM students, like others that were non-STEM and arts and humanities came, but I couldn't turn them away. So they're all, and I'll explain how that, that plays out a little bit later on. And so they talked about those places. And so we said, like, well, what are the places where you feel comfortable? And then they mentioned like a third floor space in the library where most of their friends gather and they feel comfortable being Black there. And we started to talk about that and what does that mean? And then the students kind of shifted the conversation to say, well, we want to be able to feel like that in all spaces of campus and not just in the third floor of the library. So that's when they shifted to talk about, or as a collective, like, well, what should we do and how could we do that? And then we talked about that notion of flourishing. What does flourishing mean to them? What do they need to flourish on campus? And how are we going to go about and creating those change? So those are some of the things that we've reflected on, excuse me. What would you like to change on campus? And then the students, talking together, they came up with their plan, which would be some kind of, because they felt like there were many ethnic clubs on campus that celebrated their ethnicity, but they wanted a space that would really focus on academics, because they also talked, they wanted a place that would address things like, how do they get internships? How do they learn about, research? How do they apply for jobs? Like all of this information, how do they go on study abroad? All of this information that they felt wasn't as accessible to Black students, because there was one student that recounted a story of, and I don't remember which office, where she went in to get information about a particular program, and she was pretty much dismissed. And her white peer went in and asked the same question about the same program and got all the necessary information. And so they wanted to know, well, how can we gather these resources so that Black students are having the same types of access as other students? So they thought about having like an overarching umbrella for Black student success, which they referred to as BESA, Black Excellence Students Association. And then underneath this, they would have STEM, and then they would have humanities, because we talked about like how there are similar challenges in both areas for students, but then like the resources and the internships and things like that would be very different. So they needed that specialized information, but also like there were things that would be in common. So the Black Science Student Network, that launched on January 17th. It was, very student-led. They had their articulated goals as engagement, improving the network of Black scientists through their post-secondary and industry careers, representation, highlighting the success of Black scientists on the University of Calgary and in the community, and development, so hoping professional development events for faculty and students. So for faculty, about like, where do you find these Black students that you want and all of that, how do you mentor Black students? And then for students, how do you apply for things? What should go into an application? Like, many different practical things that would help them advance their careers. And then, I'm sorry, let me just skip over that. So this was, again, the launch of the Black Science Students Network. And, they were very much in charge. They organized talking about what the network would be. They had some games to facilitate networking. And you can see, like from this picture up here, that there were quite a few students that showed up to the event. And then, so the next steps of the student group, they are currently working on a survey, because they wanted to learn more about like academics, wellness, and, social, or we just call that campus climate, specific to Black students. And even though, like, yes, there's been a lot of surveys going around campus about these things, I think, they think that it would be easier for them if they are, if they're, helping to encourage their peers to fill out this student-generated survey that would provide information. Once the group starts getting survey for this data, they will start like analyzing it and looking at it both like, you know, with some creative engagements with the data, but then also some practical things about what is needed to help Black students flourishing on campus. So some of the upcoming things that students have been talking about, the Black Science Students Network, they are hoping to have a research symposium or a poster session for Black students. Another small group within a group, and they overlap because people get interested in different things. They're very interested in mental health resources for Black students. So they've been doing the work to find out if they can have a person that's appointed, like how do those things work? They've gathered a list of different Black therapists in the city. So, and then the next event, which, Black History Month, which is on February 29th, everyone is invited to attend. The Black Science Student Network will be very visible. They'll have their table there. They will help facilitate networking. They probably will help to moderate some of the panels. We're still working out what that program is going to look like. Arts and humanities students, they want to have a Black film festival. At first they started talking about horror films, and I'm like, you can show all the horror films you want. I probably will not be there. I'll be happy to come and introduce, but I will not watch them, you know. But yeah, I told them it's up to them, but anyway. And then they also want to have an arts-based research symposium. And then in collaboration with the Brainstem Alliance, we are planning to have a 2-week summer camp for for Black students, to introduce them. It would be more of like a design challenge type of thing. So a, transdisciplinary type of engagement, but then also introducing them to some of those university spaces, like admissions. How do you apply for the office? How do you get financial aid? All those different things that are often barriers for Black students, especially first generation Black students, in accessing a college education. Okay, so yeah, so I will stop it there.
Thank you, Dr. James and Dr. Adams, for this very interesting topic. So this is now the time where both of you discuss, and after that, we're going to open the floor for questions.
Hi, Dr. James, would you like to start? You're muted.
Sorry. One of the things that's also significant here is what are some of the differences nationally? Because Dr. Adams is working in the Calgary context. I'm working in the Toronto context, and our colleagues are working. Kevin Hewitt is working in Dalhousie, and Julia Dunn is working in Hamilton. And let's talk about science, Jennifer. How do you see any difference in terms of, even outside of this, with your Black Science Network? Do you see some of those differences, or do we have enough of those information to talk about our Black students in these various contexts?
Well, we don't have enough information in the Canadian context. We have, a lot of information in the United States about the Black students' experience, based on, initial data that I've collected initial data from the Canadian Black Scientists Network. The students experience the same things, like microaggressions, isolations, getting locked out of opportunities. They experience same things, but there's not that yet that documentation here in Canada of that. So, but that also creates, it creates a challenge, because yes, while we want to document that these things exist, because people are always going to ask for, well, proof. Well, how do you know that's the case? Because this is Canada, and this is a multicultural country. But while we're doing that, we don't want to get into that trap of using the research to document the damage and to continue to replicate the damage. So trying to think about, how can we do research in a way that is moving the agenda forward rather than replicating it. And I know that with my research group, some of the things that we've been trying to do is to really look at students' experiences in relation to the colonial roots of STEM, and how, because that's the roots, that's the systemic issue. And it's, in Canada, it's in the United States, it's everywhere else. How do we unpack that and expose it so that we could begin to dismantle it? And that's a harder ask because, universities are steeped in white supremacy and in such a way that it's invisible because it's been so normalized. So how do we make that visible to people in a way that's like, yeah, this really has got to change. I didn't know that I'm thinking this way because of this. I didn't know that our students are experiencing this because of this. So how do we, that's a challenge. Like, how do we do that? And I think with STEM, it makes it even more pertinent, because if you look again at the colonial roots of STEM, race science came out of STEM. So the very science, science has been used to justify racism and enslavement. So the science that emerges from it is often embedded in that. When you think about like the health disparities that Black people experience, when you think about even things like AI that don't necessarily recognize like dark skin, if you look at diseases or medications and how they're often tested on a standardized model, which is usually white, straight, cisgendered male, so when you look at all of those things, you can go back and see that colonial hierarchy that has been set up perpetuates everything, and including science that that purports to be objective.
Thank you. I like the idea of you talking about how that whole colonial roots of science. And I'm involved in some other healthcare research where we're not only are we trying to also get Black students to also think of medicine, but one of the important things, how do we also set a situation up in our society to also get us interested in understanding what it means also to be research subjects, because even while we say we're not there as the scientist, of course, if the science program and if that medical program doesn't have a Black person on the there to bring that experience, that's one fact, and we have to do that. And while we're doing that, we're going to have to push the idea of making much more inclusive of the subject, and I think scientists will have to learn how to, or medical researchers are going to have to learn how to attract Black people into the research so that we also benefit from it. I'm also thinking that we are having this discussion and we are talking about STEM. At the same time, Jean Augustine introduced the Black History idea for Canada, Black History Month in 1995 nationally. Black history was celebrated or recognized by a number of Black community people before 1995, but it's around. So we have had Black history, we have had multiculturalism in the Canadian context, we have had employment equity that's gone out. Everyone within the last few years have been talking about Black Lives Matter. We have had everyone's doing these things. So we have to start thinking then, how is it that these policies and things are in place, but still we constantly every year having to struggle in order for people to understand how to start taking up the Black presence in the Canadian society. So this is a mammoth task that not only us will have to do. And Black History Month is, I keep wondering, has Black History Month enabled and supported changing that agenda so that it becomes our presence become much more significant to be included and to be thought of as part of the Canadian history. That's a very, very important and big task for us. So our work then is to really move towards inclusiveness and I think we have to hold universities to task. And I know Melinda is around, and I know Melinda will also take up the point of how does inclusivity really get operationalized in the universities in which we are participating, and I'll allow Melinda to talk to that whenever she gets a chance.
I didn't know I was on here to work, but that's
So
a,
it's nice to see a colleague.
thank you very much, Carl. I'm delighted that Jennifer's on here. She's a rock star at the U of Calgary. So I'm just gonna, I think Jennifer can speak to it. I mean, I can speak to it too, and I appreciate the invitation to join the conversation.
Well, I mean, you can start off, Melinda, and I can just, yeah.
Okay. Because you know, me and Jennifer and I work together. So I mean, I think the language of inclusion and inclusivity and even belonging are used widely in the university, the Canadian post-secondary sector. I think we can well ask who is included in the inclusion and whether it
Love that
actually
statement.
we use the language to reinforce those who are already privileged within an institution. And so I'm always following that word inclusion and inclusivity around to see for whom the doors are open and for whom the doors remain closed, for whom ceilings are broken and shattered, and for whom the concrete ceiling remains. And so when I look at inclusion and the language of inclusion, I rarely see Black people included unless Black people are including ourselves. So I appreciate that question, Carl, because it's a language I have been grappling with, including the shift to belonging, to see what changes, if anything, systemically and structurally in terms of the who gets in, for whom the doors are open, who gets a seat at the table, who gets to speak, have voice and recognition. So I'll turn it over to Jennifer now.
Yeah, because I mean, that's, pretty much along the lines is like about like recognizing voice, recognizing bodies, and not only recognizing, but valuing what different people have to bring to the table. And especially when we're thinking about Black people, because it's been for a long time, our voices have been silenced and they have been valued. And it's interesting. I was listening on the radio this morning, and it was like a brief thing about they said something to the effect of like, for a long time, Black people in Canada, they more or less associated with their ethnicity, but more recently, they are identifying with this notion of Blackness. And, we have to ask ourselves the question, why? And it is because the anti-Blackness that they experience, whether they were born here, whether they came here as kids or as adults, the anti-Blackness that they experience, brings that recognition that you are identified as such. And because you are identified as such by the dominant culture, you are going to be positioned as such. And then people are recognizing that they have to fight against that. And the way to fight against that is to have a collective. And I don't mean having a collective, have a collective identity, but also recognizing that there are differences amongst Black people. There are many differences amongst Black people. And so we have to be able, to recognize both. And the other thing I will say about anti-Blackness and some things that we need to be careful of here in Canada, in the United States, basically the attack on EDI is an attack on Black people. It's an attack, and it's an anti-Black attack. It doesn't have to do with other ethnicities and everything, but it's anti-Blackness steeped in anti-EDI. So when people start having that kind of rhetoric, like, we don't want EDI, or what is EDI, start to really unpack exactly which population are they referring to. Who is the one that would be most affected by any kind of EDI legislation. And I mean, yes, when you're here in somewhere like Alberta, you have other identities that are constantly at attack. And I always, believe that if they're going for one group, they're going to eventually come to Black people if they don't go for Black people first. So the attack on trans students, trans identities, and we have to think about those Black students too that have those intersectional identities, and how they would be even triply oppressed by some kinds of anti-trans legislation, because we know too that our communities can be quite, homophobic, and that's something that we need to recognize within our communities and work against that too. But when we start to talk about, oh, they're putting legislations against trans people, who do you think they're going to come for next? And then thinking about like those kids that have the intersectional identities again, those are going to be the ones that are going to lose the most when they have this kind of legislation. So we have to always be thinking about, not only ourselves as Black people, but who are they coming for, and in what ways, and how is that going to come to us next? And we have to be preemptive about that.
One quick question, and I like the experience of that you bring to this discussion of race, Jennifer. Because there's this unease in the Canadian context is to collect data on race, and to be explicit about racial identities, racial information, etc., etc. And so that also hampers the kinds of conversations we can have in a very deliberate way in the Canadian context. And so there's this tendency that we will borrow the discussion of race, racism, et cetera, from the US, that's happening over there, et cetera. So how far do you think, especially in this context, Canada has come in terms of really looking in very seriously, or even having conversation, or even saying that we're doing EDI, and in that way we're deliberately looking at race? Because I keep thinking of many organizations have been celebrated for their employment equity programs over the years. They even gotten awards for their EDI. And the report they will have, for gender, people with disability, Indigenous people, and then visible minority. And then when you look at the visible minority, since it's not disaggregated, then the Black people, Black scholars are not even gaining access to those opportunities. So today, when we're talking of EDI and so forth, they have to have special programs to be attracting Black faculty or Black scholars. So, and to simply do these targets, yeah, they might be useful, but at the same time, how far are we going to, rather putting it this way, shouldn't we therefore come to, in a Canadian context, think about race just as others are thinking about race, and talking about race and admitting the factors that race might play in terms of people getting access to employment and to schooling and so forth. So what do you think in terms, I know I went on for a while with my question, but my question is, talk about using your American experience, interpret us here with our work with the issue of race.
Well, I think that I've been here in Canada for 6 years, but I've had like lots of family ties and stuff like that, because I'm like what Stuart Hall would call like the trice diasporized. And I have seen here in Alberta, because I mean, most of my cousins, like in Toronto and Vancouver, I know that, it's a tangent, but anyway, I've seen like the Black population increase here exponentially, and so I've seen that. I really strongly believe that Canada still needs to get, their own data, its own data on race, and it has to be done vis-a-vis the history of Black people in Canada. So that means uncovering the enslavement, uncovering the people that migrated from the American South to Canada, whether it's on the Underground Railroad or whether it's because of the promise of land, so learn about and unearth those histories before they're like really, really lost and, hard to find, so that's also important. I would say to look at Canadian laws and see how those laws were formed in relation to race. Because I was very sobered by reading 1619 and just looking at how even things that you don't think about, like accounting, the structures of accounting was very much tied to enslavement, and Canada uses a lot of the same structures as the United States, and then there are some that are different. So how have those been developed and tied to, both, Indigenous people and to Black people? I think it's very important to make sure that these experiences are front and center, and it doesn't matter what discipline you're in, because I've done that work in science, and I always preface that I'm not a historian and I'm not a historian of science, but I needed to see these structures in order to know where and how this racism emerged, both society-wise and in science. So it's very important to keep those things front and center so that we don't think that, oh, well, this whole race thing just emerged in a vacuum. It was only since George Floyd that this race emerged. George Floyd happened because of 500 years of history. It didn't happen in a vacuum, so we have to really unpack these things and think about the relevance and the history and the experiences of those for Canada, so that's, the historians have to do that deep work in order for all of us to be able to access that work, so that when we are talking about equity, that we can say, well, these are the roots of the inequity here in Canada, and these are the roots that we need to kill in order for everyone to move forward. So.
Great points. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Over to Timmy.
Thank you. So thank you both for the very enlightening conversation we've had. I want to open the floor now for questions. If you have questions, you can use the emoji to raise your hand, or you can type it in to the chat. And our experts, that you can tell that they're subject matter experts, they'll be able to answer your questions. Okay, we have Amanda raising her hand. Okay, please speak.
Hi there. I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm definitely learning a lot within this short period. I think a lot of the conversation revolved around community and mentorship for Black students in particular. And obviously it shouldn't rely only on Black alumni or Black staff to mentor other Black students. So I was thinking about what kind of training or support should a non-Black mentor need to have to properly support a Black student, and what you would have any conversation on that.
I mean, I could start. I mean, for one thing, like a non and Black people need training and mentorship too, because if you think about it, we were all educated in this very anti-Black racist system. So there are probably ways that our own, anti-Blackness has been internalized and normalized for us. So as far as mentorship, it would be about aiming to make it, well, first of all, to know that Black students, as well as other students, experience like racialized and gender, and sexuality microaggressions. And then to know that, the nature of some of those aggressions, to have the notion that to believe your students, if they tell you something, don't do that devil's advocate thing. Well, maybe they were thinking about this. If your student says they experience X, Y, and Z, That's how they're experiencing it. Take their word for it. Then also like building up structures. Well, how, you know, how are you conducting your research space? Are you allowing, you know, all researchers to equally participate and to bring, you know, their voices to bear? Are you, you know, are other people speaking more than others? Are other people taking leadership more than others? How can you foster those people that may not be taking, you know, leadership? How do you allow people to have their ideas, you know, you know, in the mentorship? How, you know, what types of peer mentorship are you fostering? You know, like you know, so you have to think about all of the different relationships, you know, and all, you know, and thinking about, you know, things about like empathy, care, and humility, you know, those things, because humility is like, yes, you don't know everything about everything, because especially people from the dominant culture are also ready to dismiss people's, you know, racialized, gendered people's experiences and do like what I just mentioned, a devil's advocate thing. That you don't need to do that. All you need to do, student came and say to you, I need help with this, you know, have conversations about, well, what happened? You know what I mean? How did it make you feel? And another thing is like, learn how to manage those things. Don't turn it over to another faculty of color and thinking that because, oh, you know, well, this is a, you know, a Black woman, you know, young Black woman that I'm mentoring, and she's having this issue, I can't deal with it, so let me just, you know, send her over to Jen. You know, that's not the way to solve it. The way to solve it is maybe you as the mentor would have a conversation with Jen or whoever that peer is. This student came to me with this problem, you know, what are your suggestions? You know, and I'm, you know, and some people are more than willing to do that, but then, you know, it has to be that balance between that hidden labor of Black people or other racialized people too. You know what I mean? So there has to be a way, you know, for people to be able to learn from each other, you know, to learn about the experiences of the other, to learn how to manage the other. You know, maybe you have a colleague that you see have a lot of, you know, racialized students that they're mentoring, and they're non-racialized or they're white. You can go and you can ask them, you know, you can go and ask them maybe for some help and things like that. So yeah, so there's many, you know, so those are just some of like the, you know, I guess suggestions. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but you know, yeah. Just, I guess maybe it's like the disposition or the attitude about mentorship, and thinking about mentorship as a learning process where you're learning about yourself, your own identities in relation to the students. You learn about your own spaces of privilege and power in relation to your students. So that's about, it's a lot of self-learning and reflection.
Some authors use the word sponsor versus mentor. And sponsor me, and they interpret sponsorship to make possible, enable, so forth, those kinds of movements of others. I tend to think of mentorship as sometimes it's more important of the person naming me as mentor rather than me presenting myself as mentor. And so therefore, cross-racially, that what happens. So because and if we think of mentorship then is something that this person has, or the way this person navigates life or navigate or negotiate something that I quite admire, and I name that person's mentor. It's the action, the way in which that mentor might have done something that I identify as the thing that I want to be able to emulate because of who they are. So think of ourselves in that respect, and therefore it might never be you. So there could be cross-gender mentor or sponsor, cross-race gender sponsor or mentor. So we have to think of mentorship and sponsorship in this holistic way. The other thing that is important for me is that once you take on the role of mentor or sponsor, you're learning from the person. So it's not I know everything and therefore this is the way to go. I'm asking us as sponsors or mentors to say, listen, okay, I have an experience and I'll share my experience and work with you with your experience, because probably I experience what I experience at a different time and space, which might not be quite relevant to now or to your experience. but having shared it and work with you to think of how you can negotiate your time and space might be the way in which my work with you as a mentor or sponsor might be most useful. So I see it's not so clear-cut as a mentor sponsor than the mentee or so. But whereas some coming together and working together as moving forward with what I can enable, teach, or support, if that answers your question. Thank you for your question.
Okay. Ola, you can ask your question.
Thank you, everyone. I was just wondering, will it be part of EDI initiative if there's a different entry requirement for Black students to increase their representations in schools? Would that be part of these solutions?
Well, I mean, I know that at the University of Calgary, the Black medical students, they advocated for a Black admission. And the reason why those things have to happen is because you still have people that have like a bias lens when they're reviewing it. Sometimes it's unconscious and at other times it's very conscious and deliberate. And then as far as requirements are concerned, you have to make sure, like, you have to think about like those community and historical structures, because for example, I just interviewed a young student, and this is in the United States, about getting more Black boys involved in STEM, because there's like a program at the American Museum of Natural History, and we're having trouble getting Black boys to apply. And one of the things that he said, because in order for them to apply, they've had to have been a part of the museum program before that. Not all students have access to those programs for different reasons. And, it could be geography. It could be that they're in a school that's not partnered with the museum. I mean, many different reasons. And so he said to make that not a requirement, so you have to think about the requirements that are for entry into something. What are those requirements based on? And then how do those requirements position people who don't have access to those things that would allow them to meet those requirements? And what can you do to mitigate that? I don't know, Carl, if you want to have.
No, I think that answers, I think these are not so clear cut, actually. And that's the point. We're going to have to deal with each situation as it comes up, and of course, constantly assessing the context in which we're operating. Because, we might make some decisions today, and next week things change. So we should always be working within the context and making sure that we are responding to people's experience in relation to the context.
Thank you. Ola, I hope that answered your question. I know Aaron also has his hands up.
Me? Hi. Actually, my pronouns are they, she. Um, it was a very interesting talk, and thank you so much. Dr. Carl and Jennifer, like you both mentioned dismantling the colonial structure that we have. Like specifically, like Carl mentioned AI, and I work for a university, Athabasca. We're north of Edmonton, and we were using more and more AI models these days, and more AI algorithms. And there is an inherent bias in these algorithms and things like that. So like for me personally, like if I find that we have like some discriminatory software or some discriminatory AI, I can pull it offline, and I don't care if they'll fire me. Like I threaten to quit all the time anyways. But outside of the educational sphere, it really just it comes down to money, I find, and like businesses in general, and like everyone is going to be using these AI models and using AI, and they don't really seem to care because it's cheaper for them to deal with bad publicity than to actually try to fix these tools that they're using. So how do we do that on like a, a bigger level, larger scale, like not just within the educational sphere, but how do we push for that and more inclusion and that kind of stuff?
So, you use the word, it comes down to money, which is so significant here. And, so we can do all what we say. We can do all the idea of insisting on using equity, inclusion, and diversity. We can, and social justice, we can do all that thing. But the organizations, the institutions, and even governments are going to say it comes down to money. So therefore, we have to start assessing that. What's going to be a role in this, in making that sure that money is understood in relation to how it's going to impact the life chances and life experiences of the different groups of people? I don't know, because we have to admit the capitalist system exists. And through that capitalist system, the work continues to be what it is. And I just think it's constantly doing that necessary assessment in order to change things. And the more we can have these conversations, and not just simply once a year, but all the time, and having institutions reflect on its policies. Because I keep thinking of, if the institutions are using policies today that it used 13, 20 years ago, are they still useful policies given the context of change? All these things become important questions. And so there's no easy answer, but it's going to mean actively responding to the institutions' programs and practices. And the more things come on board, we have to pay attention to how things are. We talk of AI, and I was paying attention to reports, recently, and how AI is taking over some of the things. And recently, I was paying attention to the fact that, and this is kind of not related but related. These checkout counters in many of these places, you have self-checkout, and you can you can go to the cashier. And in some places they're reducing this self-checkout because they're noticing the number of the benefits they thought that self-checkout might have produced based on finances and so forth. It's not happening that way. And people work with relationships as well. So that in itself, so we have to be, institutions should cautiously note when they're introducing things such as AI and other things, the implications it might have to their service to others.
Yeah, and I think that, again, that's a good question when we think about things like AI in relation to cost and money, because like as Carl said, this is a capitalist, or what I don't remember who was that chapter in the book, like the low capitalist system, where the people who are the poorest and the ones who who are the most oppressed are the ones who are most affected by it. Because if you think about the example that Carl just uses, checkout, who are the ones that lose jobs because of it? So it's always asking those questions. Now, the question of AI also brings up that importance and why it is important to have diversity in the field, but not only diversity in people who are developing AIs, but also education and how, how the system was set up so that AI is going to privilege, certain values and language and different things like that, and how it is not, like the things that are going to be absent from AI. So these are things that, or questions or dialogues that need to happen. And obviously, yes, again, the money thing, but those dialogues need to happen within the company. And while I think that it's important to have policies on the books that say X, Y, and Z, sometimes we know that policies don't really go far from the book. you know? So there
Mm.
has to be something around those policies. It's like, if we have an EDI policy, how are we fostering that? And going deeper than just having like a PowerPoint or somebody come in to facilitate some training, but it's about having somebody maybe that's going to foster that conversation within the company, that's also getting, like, if it's an AI company, that's also getting at, like, well, why is AI biased? You know, what are the roots of that? You know, if we go to a pharmaceutical company, well, why do our medications work for certain populations and not? You know what I mean? Like, we have to always be looking at the roots of why things happen before we can really think about, well, if it, you know, how are we going to dismantle it? And so that it doesn't run the risk, as I've mentioned before, of just replicating the damage.
Thanks, Jennifer. I love your earrings.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Carl.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. We have Linda is raising her hand as well.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So I just wanted to put a little, I don't know, support in for a project that Dr. Gideon Christian is working on right now in the law school. He is working on the effect of the way AI is right now on especially Black people. And he's approaching it from a legal analysis. So the idea is going to be, and correct me if I get this wrong, Pamela, the idea is going to be to, first of all, take a look at the reality. And the reality is, as Jennifer mentioned, Dr. Adams mentioned, the studies, the way the AI is created is not involving a diverse population. So the identification is often incorrect, especially with new Canadians, because they don't have a database. And so it's very dangerous to rely on that as a screening tool. That's kind of what he's working on. And so we should keep our eyes open for that work, because I'm hoping that it'll raise awareness and also affect some of the laws and policies that are out there. And if you want to add anything, Pamela, please do, because I might have missed something important.
No, Linda, I think you described it well. He's looking at the impact, particularly on how police use AI in their facial recognition softwares. Yeah.
You know, when you talked about how police or anyone use some of these things, I keep thinking of how lived experience is interpreted, you know, and therefore we'd want anybody using AI or using any such thing would understand their lived experience that they're bringing to the use of a particular program, because their lived experience is not put aside, and therefore they're looking at things with neutral eyes. And the way in which lived experience ever so often is being used these days to kind of signal and to make us think that only certain kinds of people, or racialized people or Black people, have lived experience, but others don't. That it doesn't take us any further in terms of moving towards really bringing the conversation towards inclusivity. So I would be concerned about how AI must, and whoever uses AI, takes into account their lived experience in what they do.
Bias there. Okay, Annika.
Awesome. Hi, can you hear me? My voice is a little okay, awesome. First of all, thank you so much. Like, this conversation was like so informative and I really enjoyed it. My question, it's a little bit off topic, but it goes with what we talked about, like in community and stuff. But like, what are like, do you guys know some ways like elementary or like high school teachers can like help Black students prepare for and like succeed at university? Like, what are some ways that we can like enhance their support like before they go into post-secondary? Yeah.
Well, I
I
would
feel,
say, oh, go
huh?
ahead. No, go ahead.
I think one of the major things I think of is what happens in kindergarten, elementary school is important to also paying attention to how high school eventually lead you to a particular program. I also feel like what we're doing and what Jennifer is doing, sometimes the exposure of students in high school to university program might give them particular insights and paths towards those routes that they might eventually go. I also feel that in the Ontario situation where we have streaming, I don't know what that might be where you are, but where students are streamed into particular areas or program areas because teachers might assume the Black students might not be prepared for a particular area of education because of who they are, etc., etc. Intervening very early into that process would be absolutely critical. Involving parents as well into some of these conversations. But I also feel very importantly, and I don't think we pay enough attention to this, how peer groups also influence and inform those kinds of direction. Because if my friend doesn't go into a particular area, I might not go there because there might be, I might have confidence that my friend knows better than I do, and therefore will choose the path that my friends. So it means doing a whole lot of work in covering all the different areas that the students and young person might be very, very keen on looking at when we're going to assist them and support them in their journey through schooling.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so I will just add to that, like just what Carl said, like paying attention to again those structures that like the streaming, the types of class, that Black students often end up with in like, Black students are often called out for behavior more than white students. So also pay attention to that to ensure that if a Black student is getting called out for behavior, is it really behavior or is it something else, or is it somebody's own perception of behavior? And I think from early on, like from kindergarten all the way through, having identity affirming spaces for them. So that means that, I go back to STEM just because that's where my area has been. So, early on when kids are very curious, allow them to explore the questions that they want to explore, having books that have diverse representation of scientists or just people doing stuff. So really looking at who is represented in the books, who are provided to students as examples of people both historically and contemporarily, recognize that, there are different entryways into different things. So if a kid is into the arts somehow, try, seeing if there could be more like, interdisciplinary things happening in the classroom, collaborative learning activities where students are required to maybe rotate leadership roles so that they are able to lead their peers, or taking turns in leading their peers. Look at again the students who you call on more than others, or the students who are always jumping up to be called on, because research shows that Black students, at least the ones that are in the States, that they're less likely to raise their hands, so it could be maybe it's different, or if they raise their hands, they're often looked over, and then because they're looked over, then they stop raising their hands. So really thinking about what are the different ways that you can affirm the students' identities and the knowledges that they're bringing into the classroom. And like thinking about like Black History Month now, everybody likes to have like the food and native dress thing. How can you go beyond that? How can you introduce students to different figures, you know, whether it's in history or English ELA, English literature, arts, or whatever it is. How can you bring examples of Black people and examples of maybe like the way that they're approaching things with their students? Because not only will your Black students benefit, but other students are going to benefit as well by being exposed to different people and to different ways of knowing.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I like that, and I want to add. You know, I'm one of those students who never put up my hand in class, actually, but importantly as well, I'm thinking here where we work with students who have ideas about where they want to go, and I think every so often, especially when I think of science and math, who think that they don't have to be culturally relevant, or they do not have to give examples that relates to the experiences of particular students, because the idea of in these areas it's neutral, you know, compared to social science and humanities. But I always think of how this student who, and I give this example, this student just came out of his math class, and he failed math. It's typically male. Failed math and went into basketball. Went into gym and playing basketball, and he scored all these baskets, you know. And one wonders, how is that possible? And what happened? This student was calculating the distance to run, the angle of the ball, all those kind of things. He just did all this math. And those math did not play out when he was in his class. So therefore, what would be useful then for teachers when we're talking to students is to bring students into the experience, use the experiences of all the students into that discussion, and also make students see what they're doing in their everyday lives are also implementing science, math, and humanities, and literature, all those kinds of things. And the more teachers can do that, the more they will make teaching and the education process more relevant and responsive to the students.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both of you.
I would like to just make a comment to support what Carl said about peer groups. Many years ago, I knew a Black young woman whose grades dropped. And when she was questioned about that, she said she didn't want to do better than her. She had her peer group were all white. She didn't want to do better than her friends. And she and I had a really great conversation about this, because she was in grade 11 and needed to understand how those grades would affect, how low grades would affect her ability to get into university. So knowing peer groups and knowing how those peer groups affect our students is always helpful.
And sometimes peer groups are play a more influential role than parents, despite the fact that we might say, let's say, yeah, the parents is more important. The students make those decisions.
Most definitely. And I think media too, I mean, the kind of role models that this high school students see played out in the media is also very important. Okay, thank you very much. We've had, I know we could go on and on with this conversation, but it's 1:42 p.m. Mountain Standard Time now. And I want to hand over to Mina to give the vote of thanks. We certainly would like to have Dr. Carl James and Dr. Jennifer Adams back again. Very insightful and engaging conversations that we've had today. Thank you.
Yes, you can make Black History Month August instead.
Yeah.
Or you might want to follow Britain and have it in October, I'm not sure.
Well, as a research associate at the ACLRC, I would like to thank you, Dr. James and Dr. Adams, on behalf of the center. We really are grateful for the time and effort you took to talk about the Securing Black Future project. You made us understand the goals of the project, and it was very interesting to hear about the statistics, the research you've done, and how to engage Black students. It was a great discussion between the two of you. And thank you once again for sharing your experiences and expertise with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks very much for
Thank you.
having us.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank